Okay, so why the course? Uh, I noticed there are few US Americans in the class, and maybe some of you, I'm an American citizen too, may feel that the topic has just become obsolete today, since here at least the effort to create an authoritarian populist government or even move toward an authoritarian populist regime has been defeated. I'm not usually a pessimist in politics, but I immediately have to say that defeat could very well be temporary and may even happen so easily because the person who was leading the effort has been so had was so much worse at politics than, let us say, Mr. Modi or Mr. Orban or Mr. Kaczynski and Mr. Putin, unfortunately, too. So we were lucky in the United States. And that means, of course, the topic does not go away, even here. Uh, uh, 70 million voters, right? Uh, Something like 70 million voters, of whom, let us say, a significant portion, hard to quantify, share the the anti-constitutional assumptions of the leader for whom they voted for, uh, are still there, and they will be there. And in that sense, uh, whatever the temporary outcome is, and I think it is a very positive one, potentially, it is only a temporary outcome. The longer term problems have to be addressed, uh, both learning from the experience of other countries and addressing the sociological, economic, and political roots. Uh, that's what this course is going to try to do. I don't have to tell people here that the phenomenon we're investigating, at the very least, is present in uh, on the governmental level in two European and several Latin American countries. I would say two or three Asian countries too, and in Africa as well, in several contexts. And it is present beyond that also on a level of, of mobilization, whether from below or from the in-between level of political parties. So it's a genuinely international phenomenon. In this sense, the United States, uh, often uh, uh, vouted for its exceptionalism, is not an exception. The defeat is not exceptional, because there are Latin American places where it has already happened before. But as those defeats in Latin America, as Emmanuel will certainly tell us, show, they didn't mean the end. They just meant, in many cases, a transformation of form, a transformation of the leader, a transformation of the rhetoric. But in some form or another, the phenomenon has returned. Uh, Interestingly, in your country, Emmanuel, the leading name of Juan Perón is still a political concept, although the man and even his wives have departed the political scene. So we are dealing with something which is genuinely significant. No American exception, no U.S. American exceptionalism, and in that sense, whether you are from the US, which I think only about two or three people in the class are, or from other part of the world, this is something that we all must take seriously. I didn't mention Hungary much so far, but obviously the poor ELTA students who are not here, and Barbara who is, uh, will know, whether they agree with me politically or not, that the phenomenon is present in Hungary too. And I don't agree with those who think that it is Mr. Orban who invented it, because since I'm older than Barbara, or probably the other Hungarian students too, I know that already during the regime change in 1989, 1990, and indeed in Poland the same was true, the phenomenon was present. The phenomenon was present, and the modality of the regime change was challenged from, I would say, right-wing populist quarters. For obvious historical reasons, left-wing populism is not strong in Hungary and Poland, but it is, of course, a phenomenon elsewhere. Many countries, there are dual populisms, both from the left and the right. I know people will contest whether one of these is even a populism at all, but we can talk about that later on. So we are dealing with an international phenomenon, one that actually has meant in I don't know how many settings now in Latin America, but in 2 settings in Central Europe, further east in other settings too of the ex-Soviet Union, meant actual coming to power. The phenomenon may not be authoritarian when in opposition, although sometimes it is, but in power it always shows an authoritarian side, a strongly authoritarian side. And the retrogression of democracy, what is sometimes called backsliding, I don't love this term, but in the literature it's called democratic backsliding, a kind of weakening of the process of democratization and a turn in another direction is something that we are confronting. We're confronting in lots of places. Not everyone would agree that populism is the key, or at least a major key to the new authoritarianisms. There will be disagreement on this with respect to, let's say, Hungary, where Kimlén Sepely has argued against this. Certainly, some of my best Russian students who are not here, but you know them. Igor is from Ukraine, but in any case, there are some Russian students previously here think that Putin's version was never really populist. But this never really populist is a little bit misleading in the sense that that once in government, to actually take the populist rhetoric seriously becomes a problem. I think also true in some of the Latin American cases. So an authoritarian regime, a new form of authoritarianism, or even a hybrid authoritarian democratic regime could be related to populism, even when its populist credentials become questionable. A lot of people call our president, whose name I try not to ever mention, our ex-president, I'm so happy to say, a faux populist. Yeah, he's a faux populist, but wasn't Huey Long a faux populist in many respects? Wasn't Juan Perón a faux populist in many respects? If we mean authoritarianism, an authoritarian regime which uses populism in purely rhetorical ways, then of course many of the populist governments are faux populist. That does not mean, however, that the phenomenon is not related to what we will call populism here. Well, what is it that we call populism here? I mean, there are even books written with the title, Jan Werner Müller, What is Populism? And in the anthologies edited, many of them by my former student, brilliant student, Carlos de la Torre, and others, what is populism is one of the big topics, right? You read the major authors, and almost all of them raise this question. This is done by Müde and Kaltwasser in their book Populism: A Short Introduction. It is done by Wayland and Roberts and many people. Our own Federico Finkelstein does too in his book on populism and fascism. In any case, almost everyone raises this question, and I think we have to deal with the topic of definition here. Some of you know that I love this topic, and I know that it is a boring topic for most of you. Definitions, why do they matter when we study society? In the other class, for example, on revolutions, I spent a whole week, 2 sessions on what is a revolution. It's not a meaningless question. And of course, it's not a meaningless question, what is populism? But what kind of definition should we give? Some of the literature proposes minimal definition. Those of you who read some of the literature will know that that, for example, Müller Kaltwasser proposed a minimum definition, which is uh, uh, very simple, a thin ideology, uh, 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 a, uh, uh, a, a proposition about society involving mannequin relations between the genuine people and its enemies. And finally, the concept of the general will, which they take from Rousseau, but which I very often translate in the form of embodiment of the popular will in a leader or a leadership. That's all that they say. Uh, uh, um, but remember, leadership is not even part of that minimal definition. So once you define the phenomenon in that way, or through any of the other minimal definitions offered, there are going to be dozens and dozens and dozens of populisms, right, in history. I would say, I was just reading Hannah Arendt on revolution for my other class, and if you want to look on revolution 75 to 77, discusses the populist phenomenon. And her example, although she doesn't use the word populism, is the French Revolution. Now, if you start with the French Revolution, and indeed you could go back to the British and even the American for some examples of this, you will have, by a minimal definition, probably dozens and dozens and possibly even over 100 cases. And what is the danger of this? But the danger of this is that lots of versions of democratic politics, radical democratic politics, will wind up being included. I mean, a lot of people who emphasize radical democracy or the democratization of existing democracies could fit into a minimum definition. After all, social democracy had its enemies, the bourgeoisie. The idea of using the name of the people in a kind of thin ideology is characteristic of many modern parties, what Otto Kirchheimer called the catch-all party. Typically uses a thin ideology to bring different positions together, and the idea of at least temporarily embodying the people being able to speak in its name is also present in democratic politics. Now, of course, I added the word temporary, which is not generally used by populists. The same would be true for other minimal definitions. We wind up having many, many cases and sometimes conflating the popular and the populist. Well, why not then have a maximum definition? I don't want to tease my friend Federico Finkelstein, but I will now. In his book, he has 17 characteristics of populism, of authoritarian populism. Well, I'm sure Emmanuel can look. The 17 do correspond to the Argentinian version, right? 16 or 17 are all found in Argentina. The question is, are they found anywhere beyond Argentina? I don't want to explore that in relationship to the 17 characteristics, but I would say if you have 17 characteristics, the likelihood is that you're going to have very, very few cases. Surely, this Trumpist episode will never fall in to so many requirements modeled on the Peronist case. I mean, Peron controlled all the branches of government, and Trump, fortunately for us, never did, and so on. So what one needs is a definition someplace in between the minimum and the maximum. I don't want to pronounce myself as a follower of Aristotle, although I surely am in this respect, but the in-between level is probably right. You'll see in just a second that I will propose something like 6 characteristics of what I call the phenomenon, but how to arrive at that 6. And then I have a problem, and the problem is the problem of normativity. In other words, I want to explore populism today because I think it's the key to the new forms of authoritarianism which are current. But is populism necessarily authoritarian? I mean, after all, populists speak in the name of popular sovereignty, which is an ideological linchpin of modern democracy, right? If you read, for example, the book of Edmund Morgan, Inventing the People, you'll see that in the process of fashioning a democratic order, popular sovereignty was generated as an alternative to sovereignty inherent either in a single person or a group or an elite or a stratum. Popular sovereignty means, in a way, or should mean, that we're all together uh, uh, participating in rule, in the business of rule, and we are ultimately the source of the authority of those to whom we give temporary powers to speak in our name. So in that sense, I think populism works within the democratic imaginary. It's within the democratic imaginary. I think that is not the case, at least for fascism, and for Stalinism, at least, it is no longer the case, even if it was the case for the Bolsheviks at the time of the revolution of 1905 and 1917. So it's within the democratic imaginary. So there are democratic claims being made, and I yet think it's authoritarian. So a definition that prefigures the authoritarianism would be unacceptable unless we take that definition from one of the major advocates of populism today. And there's only one person who can come into play here with some minor competitors, and this is Ernesto Laclau, an Argentinian who wrote several things on populism, but Unpopulist Reason is his major work. Ernesto, who was a very fine gentleman whom I knew, and who even participated in some new school activities, taught a course with his wife Chantal Mouffe for several years. Ernesto was self-admittedly a populist. Interestingly enough, Emmanuel, correct me if I'm wrong, he was a young Peronist to begin with, then became a radical Marxist, follower of I was going to say Ludwig Althusser, but Louis Althusser is the correct term. Why was Ludwig popped into my mind? I don't know. But in any case, Louis Althusser, he was a follower of Louis Althusser for a long time. And then I think correctly realized that the assumption of all Marxism, including Althusser's, namely the proletariat as a universal class, is no longer workable in the modern world, nor does the deterministic logic available in so much Marxism work in the modern world. And so he shifted back to populism. He recovered his youth. I hope that temptation will not arise for me, because I was a fairly radical Marxist at one point, never a Leninist or authoritarian, by the way, in case you're interested. I hope that temptation will not arise for me, but it did come up for him. He recaptured his youth, and on very good grounds, because populism, older than Marxism, again, Hannah Arendt, pages 75 to 77, shows it alive for the French Revolution. Populism older than Marxism postdates Marxism. And indeed, if you really examine the practice of Lenin and Mao, you can see that a purely proletarian appeal no longer worked for them. And so the theory turns multi-class in its appeal, something that Gino Germani, an Italian-Argentinian scholar, has insisted on, a characteristic of populism. And so the people of whom Marx uh, makes fun of as a category in critique of the Gotha program and elsewhere. Marx and Engels were never populists, interestingly enough. Returns already from Marx and Lenin. Why? Well, I mean, I give you two guesses, right? Or even one guess, because everyone can guess it. They're operating peasant countries, where multi-class politics was necessary, inevitable. And already this is discussed by Engels toward the end of his life in an important essay. And of course, Lenin has to return to it, and Mao even more. So populism predates Marxism to some extent, corresponds to it, and then postdates it. This is Ernesto Laclau's assumption. But Ernesto Laclau has other influences on him too, above all Claude Lefort, and he's, in this sense, Chantal Mouffe even more, in his own self-understanding, a democratic theorist. So populism, he returns to populism in spite of the actual history of Perón in Argentina, because he thinks it is a democratic alternative. I don't know if he ever thought about this, how he could argue this as an Argentinian, perhaps because in its Kirchnerian form, it has become reconciled with political democracy. But it's hard for me to think of this democratic turn within Peronism, given the actual career of Juan Perón. But it happens. So Ernesto Laclau thinks of populism as a radical democratic conception. And then, of course, Chantal Mouffe clearly links it. She's, of course, not Argentinian herself. She becomes an adopted Spaniard, a theorist for Podemos. And in the Spanish context, surely the idea that this is a democratic alternative has made a certain amount of sense. That has consequences, by the way, for populism. Can one remain a populism if one makes the turn that Chantal Mouffe has made? But in the case of Ernesto Laclau, he does, because he's above all not a politician, but a very rigorous theorist. And he begins with the problem of heterogeneity. If indeed we're going to turn populist, we have to recognize that the people are as a collectivity heterogeneous. Difference of demands, difference of needs is characteristic. Unless we have some kind of democratic strategy, we cannot deal with that difference. We cannot deal with that multiplicity. Mr. Biden will find this out already probably this afternoon, if he did not already know it. In this sense, one must create a framework in order to even democratize society, which allows that heterogeneity to act. If you want to do it in a democratic way, then we have to rethink populism, and this is what Laclau has done. So, focusing on Laclau has allowed me in defining the phenomena in such a way that I don't prejudge the question of authoritarianism, and yet remain open to exploring its authoritarian dimensions. The method I use for this is immanent criticism. All of you are too young to have been around when I gave courses on a Frankfurt school, and maybe someday I should do that again, even though, of course, all my work in some sense is influenced by, above all, Habermas and Adorno. And it is Adorno, but also Habermas to some extent, who have written the most interesting articles on what immanent criticism is. Both Gene Cohn and I have followed them in this. Immanent criticism means that you begin with a discourse and you explore it in a double way. One being exploring what it leaves out from the phenomenon. That will be the second step here. The first step, maybe the third step here. The second step is to examine the relationship of its normative assumptions to the phenomena that are described. The first step, though, is to take the scheme seriously, to take the components of the scheme seriously. I've written on this a lot. I can send you the text, which will be the first chapter or the introduction, really, of our joint book with Gene Cohen. But I've done this elsewhere, and so I can only summarize. I should only summarize what it is I take from Ernesto Laclau's ideal-typic catalog of the major components of populism. The first is the category of the people. There's no populism without invoking the people. Very beautiful text of Hannah Arendt indicates that could really, in principle, be done in two ways, as a plurality or as a multitude. Populism always does it the second way. And it has to do with exactly what I said already. If we need unification in action, plurality can only lead to a discussion without an end. In order to do things, in order to make decisions, in order to accomplish things, you need unification. So the people, at least on one level, must be assumed to be one. Margaret Canavan, who is a second author who has written interesting things on populism, and whom perhaps I don't do enough justice to with my stressing Laclau so much, has indicated that it is not only the people, but popular sovereignty are a very key concept of populism. And indeed, popular sovereignty is the term which best describes the kind of powers that the people are supposedly going to be given through the populist challenge. So that's the first characteristic, the people and popular sovereignty. The second one is the construction of a chain of equivalences. The chain of equivalences means that you take the actual heterogeneity and you construct a frame within which these differences can be reconciled, brought to a single level, a single set of concepts. This idea of Laclau is one that I said is not unique to populism, and modern political parties all tend to do this, although the class parties of the past, social democracy or even Marxist-Leninism on one side and then nationalist parties on the other, tended to have fairly thick ideological frameworks, which always from the outset meant that only a significant part of the population is being addressed in terms of a philosophy of history, in terms of an economic and political theory, but a much more developed ideology. The chain of equivalences that Laclau wants to construct, and it is indeed characteristic of populism, is what has been called a thin ideology by Mudde and Kaltwasser. So a thin ideology, a chain of equivalences accomplished through a very thin ideology, which I want to say, but maybe Ernesto Laclau would not concede this, is above all rhetorical and not ideological, is what is characteristic of populism. I think this is why populism is so often a media phenomenon, because it takes its form of unifying heterogeneity from the modern media. Its sound bites, its rhetorics, its very often visual imagery. Trump, for example, was certainly, one could not attribute an ideology to Trump, and yet the role of unification through media imagery is characteristic of him. Now, immediately we need to correct this because something that Laclau doesn't say should already be said here, namely that the thin ideology is in most contexts not enough. And so almost all populisms choose a host. That's the term of Möder and Kaltwasser, they're a host ideology. Emmanuel, correct me. I think that the host ideology for Peronism is a kind of social democracy. And a host ideology for and Udipta, correct me, for Mr. Modi is Hindu nationalism. And so Laclau on this particular point needs to be immediately corrected. His ideal type needs to be enriched. But that doesn't mean that the third point does not apply. And perhaps the host ideology plays a role in this. Namely, Laclau does think that even after you have managed to unify, you actually have not been able to overcome all heterogeneity. So a part must stand for the whole, a point which is stressed by Margaret Canavan too. Populism always involves a part. Now, which part? Laclau's term for it, I never would have used it myself, but the book was written in English, and I think that he used it, the underdog. The underdog stands for the rest. I think this is really a very poor substitute conceptually for Karl Marx's proletariat, or for that matter, the French Revolution's poor, or the common people that is used in American populism, the commoners. But that's what Laclau chooses. But all he means by this is that all those who really feel themselves to be excluded and dominated. Which means, of course, that what Marx sometimes called in a derisive way the lumpen proletariat, or what he was more charitable toward the poor agrarian peasantry, would also be included. Need not be industrial workers. It can be the unemployed. It can be the others who also feel the brunt of domination. But they stand for the people. And this is important because populism always involves mobilization, and you cannot mobilize everybody at all times. So this is then the third characteristic that I derive from Laclau. The fourth one, which he derives from Carl Schmitt, is what he calls the frontier of antagonism. It's a beautiful term. Maybe it's gotten from Lacan. I'm not a reader of Lacan, so I can't judge where this comes from, whether it's Ernesto or Chantal who bring it in. But the real source of it is Carl Schmitt, as I think it's clear in Chantal Mouffe's essays on Schmitt. You know, of course, that Carl Schmitt defined the political in terms of friend-enemy relations. I consider this to be a considerable realism on Carl Schmitt's part. I don't find the view attractive, I have to say from the outset, but it's realistic for what he himself was interested in as a proto-fascist theorist, with lots of admiration for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, also, of course, Mussolini. In order to fuse the people together, in spite of heterogeneity, you need a powerful enemy. Again, Hannah Arendt, I bring her in because I'm reading her for the other class. Hannah Arendt, on the third page of describing how you can actually create one will where there are previously a heterogeneity, adds the friend-enemy relation. She's, of course, a reader of Carl Schmitt. And it's very logical, because how do you overcome the difference among all those who are brought together in a thin ideology, except to establish the fear in all of them of the other, of the enemy. I said I'm not going to mention his name much. I already did once, but you know that from the outset, friend-enemy relationships characterize the past presidency. And one of the most attractive things about Biden, and I find a lot of things attractive about him, lots of things not, but one of the attractive things about him is that he's unable to think politics in those terms. Maybe he'll be disappointed by the Republicans in this respect radically, because sometimes there are enemies in the political world. But to construct them before they have even come into existence, or to do it through your own acts and your own rhetoric, is something which is characteristic of at least Laclau's depiction of populism. Frontier of antagonism is a domestication of the friend-enemy concept. By the time Chantal Mouffe manages to finish writing the book on left populism, domestication has gone so far that we hardly have anything more than relationships of opposition and conflict. And that, of course, is part of democratic politics. But in Laclau's version, and in the case of many historical populisms, the friend-enemy relations must be taken very seriously. And finally, the notion of a strong notion of politics, de political, le politique in French, as against la politique, or just mere politics. Carl Schmitt already has inaugurated a distinction between the political and politics, and the friend-enemy relationship characterizes only the political, politics in a strong sense, which is linked in Schmitt's idea to the constituent power, foundational powers. It's not the politics that manages things, which is just politics with a small p, but the political as the foundational, as the creation of systems and regimes, which is the most dignified activity that a political individual can engage in. Now, in French theory, not so much influenced by Carl Schmitt, this distinction was democratized. I'm thinking of Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lefort. It's Lefort who has influenced Mouffe and Laclau more, but it is, I think, in some ways, Castoriadis who comes closer to an understanding of the political as the foundational. And it is this meaning that Laclau insists that populism must recover and does recover, which of course means a perspective, means a kind of secularization rather of his previous revolutionary persona, because the foundational is also in some sense revolutionary, although, as I explained to the other class, for especially Engels and to some extent even Marx, it did not necessarily involve a violent revolution. Violence is not an important category for Laclau and Mouffe, but revolutionary foundation does play a significant role in their conception. Now, what I construct following them as an answer to populism is a set of ideal types. And admittedly, things are missing, and I indicated some missing elements already. Here, I think I have to do more justice to my friend Federico, who has always insisted on at least one of these missing elements. And guess what? It's the electoral element, right? It's extremely important. Federico's work, and he'll lecture in the other class in the Friday session on this topic, is on the problem of fascism in post-fascist settings. And populism for him is a kind of post-fascism. I don't agree with that, because the lineage of some populisms, especially in the northern part of Latin America, is really from a kind of Marxist-Leninism. In this sense, Ernesto Laclau was never any kind of fascist. He comes from Marxism. And so in this sense, I think Federico is half right. And yet I think one must make a distinction between fascism, Marxist-Leninism, and contemporary populisms. And he's right in stressing the electoral dimension. Every single modern populism, every single populism really, in terms of the way I will use the category, participates in elections when out of power and allows elections to survive when in power. Are they free and fair? Were the elections in Budapest free and fair just a year ago? I don't need you to answer it, but they had to be because Orban lost. Now, why does he even do it? And does Mr. Putin do it? Are elections in Russia free and fair? As Mr. Navalny is finding out, they're not very free and they're not fair. But this is a very, very late stage. And is it still populist at this particular point? Now, how free and how fair is going to become a question. But populism at least needs to, even when it turns authoritarian, needs to preserve this electoral component. How can it do it? How can you mix authoritarianism like Orban's and free and fair elections in Budapest in a single systemic frame? Well, you can because of the modern media, which already are discovered by Mussolini and Hitler, but that was only the radio. It's not really that powerful in swaying the opinion of those who strongly disagree. There was only always a surviving left constituency in Italy, and in Germany, well, under very difficult circumstances. And surely there are strong democratic constituencies in Hungary, which is why the electoral rule has to be monkeyed around with so that Orban is not easily defeated. And that's one of the tools of contemporary populism, monkeying around with the electoral rule. But the media play a very central role in allowing the particular kind of mixture of populism with the electoral component. Still, the electoral component is there, has to be kept to an important extent because of international requirements. If Mr. Orban abolished free elections in Hungary or would violate free elections in a way that Trump has attempted to violate them after losing one, Hungary would be kicked out of the European Union. It may take a lot to get kicked out, but I think that criterion is one that cannot be violated in Hungary and Poland as easily as now it is being violated in Russia. So the electoral component is significant, and it has to be added to the ideal type. Ernesto nowhere mentions it in his work, but Chantal Mouffe, of course, assumes it in toward the left populism. And finally, one more addition, and I stop, the constitutional issue. Now, I do say that populism, following Laclau, is indeed foundational, stresses foundational politics. But the foundational, Patja Hannah Arendt, so I don't agree with her, need not mean the creation of a liberal or especially a radical democratic constitution as she imagined and wished for. The creation of a new regime, the foundation of a new regime, can be in quasi-authoritarian forms, or if you want, hybrid forms, including democratic and authoritarian elements, as indeed Perón's constitution in Argentina, which is, well, it wasn't the first populist constitution. I think that the PRI in Mexico produced, well, altered one in the 1930s. Vargas in Brazil produced a populist constitution. Indeed, populist constitutionalism mixes authoritarian and democratic elements, but it takes the constitutional creation seriously. And this is not true for fascism. So much not, it is so untrue that Mussolini lives happily under the Statuto, but Mussolini never abolishes it. And Hitler never abolishes the Weimar Constitution. Indeed, he uses it a couple of ceremonial occasions to give himself the enabling act, which has to be renewed. And he calls together some kind of rump Reichstag to actually go through the constitutional play acting. So this taking constitutionalism seriously distinguishes populism also from fascism. I would not agree with Federico that nonviolence is a characteristic. We've seen it already, even in a very small and even caricatural scale in Washington on January 6th. Violence is part of the phenomenon. So it is not post-fascist in a sense of being post-violent. And there's lots of violence in the Philippines. I suspect there's been violence, there certainly was on the state level in India already. Whether it's going to be on a national level is another question. And there has been violence in lots of Latin American populist settings. So I would not say post-violent, but I would say electoral and in some sense constitutional are characteristics of populism. And it's important because this is what distinguishes it from fascism and indeed Marxism-Leninism in power. Yeah, there's a Cuban constitution, there are Soviet constitutions, Polish and so on, but this is paper constitutionalism, not genuine constitutionalism. Orban, of course, created a new constitution. That's how he began in 2010 to 11. And Kaczynski doesn't do it because he doesn't have yet the power, the 2/3 required in the same to do the same. Would Modi want to create a new constitution for India? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but certainly he has to take constitutional politics seriously the first moment when the Supreme Court of India stands in the way of his political projects. So constitutionalism, courts become actors under populism. Orban has not abolished the Constitutional Court of Hungary, though he repeatedly packed it. Kaczynski has packed it. Maybe court packing is the populist means of dealing with constitutionalism. I leave that to the rest of the course. Okay.
Yeah, let me just raise a question. And this is going back to the distinction between post-fascism and populism. So it seems to me Finkelstein's argument is that populism in power is post-fascist. But in your argument, which is that there is a possibility of a step beyond, which is the populist regime, how would you distinguish the populist regime from fascism and or authoritarianism in general?
The lecture which I just gave was exactly 2/3 of a lecture. And you refer now to what would have been the last third. And this has to do with the forms of populism. You know, after you come up with an abstract definition I just did, we need to really recognize that the thing has forms. And there are 3 ways of talking about the forms. One of them is historical. I already mentioned the French Revolution. Its populist phase begins during the revolt against the Legislative Assembly in 1791. That's how old the thing is at the very least. And I'm thinking of Jean-Paul Marat, and I'm thinking of Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins. It's worth reading, but at least Hannah Arendt's book should be read to see how old the phenomenon is. So we're talking about a very old phenomenon, and it's bound to have epochs. The French Revolution is not really an epoch. It's really an anticipation of the whole damn thing, which is why I stress it so much. It's formative for Bolshevism. For fascism, it is the enemy. You must defeat the French Revolution, say the fascists. So really, this French Revolutionary thing is almost transhistorical now because it's so powerful in our collective imaginary. Okay, that's the other class. I'm not going to mix up the two classes too much. But the first epoch of populism is the Narodnichestvo, correct pronunciation. Igor, I did learn Russian, but it's a little rusty. And the American Populists, the American Populist Party, and the Narodnichestvo or the Narodniki invent the thing under an autocratic regime. So they really represent something which is perhaps in some ways has some parallels in the French Revolution, but it is not something that we would have to take seriously now. And the American populists are in some sense different than all that comes after them, the late 1890s and early 20th century, because of their systematically democratic role within the political order. I know that I'm prejudging the question of authoritarianism a bit too much, but I follow him in calling that phenomenon pre-populism. Classical populism is Latin American in his assumption, and it is one that Gino Germani has described as a particular phenomenon within the emergence of modernity or modernization, namely a period in which modern institutions are adopted, but in which immense majority of the population is excluded from those institutions, and where they seek a new form of inclusion through mobilization and leadership. I know this is not a great analysis of Peronism historically, but it is as a form characterizes it. And you see the same in Peru, the APRA, in Brazil, in other Latin American countries. Ecuador, on which Carlos de la Torre has written so well, has this type of classical populism. And classical populism is generally linked to specific economic policies, redistribution, and state intervention into the capitalist economy are important features of it. And this is one of the reasons why I mentioned earlier that it does piggyback on social democracy to some extent, Keynesianism, but the Latin American version of this is the model of import substitution, as it has been called in Latin America. And that's classical populism, which has this kind of economic link to it. But classical populism is followed by a third stage, neopopulism. It is one that is invented by Mr. Fujimori, I guess would be closer to the Japanese version of his name in Peru. But you have similar efforts in Colombia, Uribe, and in even Peronism in one moment is similar in the respect that the neoliberal economic strategies adopted also by Carlos Menem, who is a Peronist in other ways. So the third form then is the neo-populist form connected to neoliberalism. And then you have finally the contemporary setting in which left and right populisms represent really two different forms with a kind of socialism of the 21st century, as Mr. Chavez called it, being one possible host ideology, and in other settings, nationalism, whether religious as in Turkey or more secular as in Hungary and Poland, playing the major role. So populism has forms which represent different historical periods. This is not what Udipta asked about, though. because another way of distinguishing among populism is the organizational level. I have to be formulaic if I'm not going to steal the whole discussion. The organizational level, I would say that populism has a movement form, has a party form, has a governmental form, and has, this is the term you mentioned, a regime form also. I think at the two ends, it's fair to ask whether these are really populists. On a movement level, you can ask, since I've written a book on civil society, is this not just one of the many movements of civil society, the populist movement? And therefore, does it not participate in some kind of quasi-radical democratic politics of pressuring existing political orders? That's the one end. Indeed, a movement like Solidarity, the greatest movement in Central Europe, perhaps ever, has a populist side. Lech Walesa, his early leader, plays the populist card in presidential election in the early 90s. So existing movements can indeed have a populist component. You can have purely populist movements, or you can have movements with a populist side. And on the other side of the spectrum, on the side of regime, where authoritarianism has become really pronounced, is it still populist? Is Putin still populist in spite of his rhetoric? So the most interesting and the purest populist phenomena appear on the party and the governmental levels. Now, Udipta's question is there a difference between fascism and populism on all these levels? On a purely movement level, is a fascist movement and a populist movement really similar? Perhaps here, the category that Federico Finkelstein uses, violence, is an interesting distinguishing mark, because fascist movements are indeed violent, and populist movements on their own are not. They play the democratic game. Fascism also participates in elections, but even tries to win elections through intimidation. We've seen this just now in the United States, and perhaps we had a kind of fascist element present in the challenge against the elections just now. Perhaps a fascist element is present in some populist movements too. I don't want to say anything about Indian politics, but I think traditionally Indian politics had a fascist dimension. Whether Modi revives that or not, I leave entirely up to you. Surely Viktor Orban is not a fascist, but in Hungary too, we have seen some elements of a fascist challenge. So when populism is a movement, it's to be distinguished from fascism, but sometimes a linkage emerges. And when populism is a regime, does it really become like a fascist regime? That's really your question, Udipta. And it could, but I think as long as it still challenges itself in terms of elections, it is to be distinguished from fascism and indeed of Stalinist regimes too. So the distinction from fascism is difficult to make. Federico Finkelstein makes a distinction in terms of epochs. You know, after the humiliation of fascism in the Second World War, you can no longer be fascist. One Perón, who had sympathy for Mussolini and even to some extent National Socialism, remakes himself with a more social democratic type of host ideology. And other movements of the time do so as well. And this is even true for a regime, because Franco, who came to power with the help of fascists, and indeed with an element of fascist mobilization, comes after the Second World War, becomes a more traditional type of corporatist Catholic authoritarian. So there is something in Federico's thesis that after the Second World War it's difficult to be fascist. Is it impossible? Well, ask Golden Dawn, right? I just switched to Greece. I see a Greek name, Mario's name, and so I think of the Golden Dawn, but obviously it doesn't require Greek participation in the class to realize that in Greece that type of politics has appeared. And of course, it has some place in European politics elsewhere too. Think of the National Front, or think of the neo-fascists in Italy. Fascism has been present in contemporary settings, but Federico is right. The father and daughter relationship. You, in order to participate in European politics, the father was not acceptable, and the daughter gets rid of not only the fascist rhetoric, but to some extent the fascist advisors. I don't know if it happened to Golden Dawn just yet, but Golden Dawn is now a significant electoral factor in Greece. And in order to increase its electoral constituency, can it really still remain fascist? By the way, Fini in Italy, who was the leader of the neo-fascist party at some point, became more liberal than Berlusconi or the Northern League. And so there is in Federico's thesis still the correct element that fascism becomes increasingly difficult. And perhaps Trump, I said I won't mention his name, made a huge strategic mistake in flirting with what? I mean, something that represents maybe 5% of his electorate, namely the radical white supremacists who are willing to engage in acts of violence. Maybe it's more than 5%, maybe it's 10, but certainly in the United States, you could not win on the basis of that 10%. And he was dumb from the point of view of the actual political system in which he has to operate. He should have followed Federico's advice or Marine Le Pen's example, and not to go the other direction. But the man, of course, was a charlatan and was too ignorant to even know that right now in the United States, it's kind of hazardous to play around with the fascist components of his overall coalition. Okay.
Yeah. So I have a specific question concerning the imminent criticism method. I'm a bit confused, and maybe this takes us too far off track. I'm a bit confused about the particular methodology by which Leclau can be determined to be a adequate representative of the system. You talked about how maybe you should give more credence to other members, but it seems like, and this is partially like what I picked up on imminent criticism from the rest of the Frankfurt School, that there is this almost assumption of you are big enough, you are a clear enough defender of this model, thus we will take your word and begin to sort of edit your system. So I'm confused as to why there can be so much confidence in saying, yes, Leclau is a definitive sort of model that we should use.
All right, Adam is a brilliant guy, I can already see, and asks a question which I ask myself lots of times. My facetious answer is I follow the example of Marx. It's facetious, so remember that I have some self-doubt when I am going to answer this way. How could he select David Ricardo and Adam Smith? Right? I mean, many people wrote about political economy, right? He selects these people. Where is his confidence? I think it's a phenomenological confidence that I would say is a kind of pre-understanding. And it has to do with the fact that a highly developed theorist who is systematic and well, I started with phenomenology, but I immediately switched to Hegel. Okay, I apologize. So it's a Hegelian model, namely that the most advanced theory represents the self-understanding of history. Oh, Adam, I can see your face. It's so doubtful, but you have read Hegel. I can already see on you. And what is he thinking of? Well, I'm thinking of, for example, Hegel's philosophy of history, which ends with the absolute spirit. And who is the spokesman for the absolute spirit? Hegel. How can he speak to the absolute spirit? Because he has interpreted Kant, Fichte, and Schelling, who really express the highest level that Geist has reached historically. Now, putting myself in Marx's place was already involved a lot of chutzpah, to use the Yiddish word, and now putting myself in the place of Hegel is even worse. But you can see this method, right? Now, I prefer it always to empirical analytical social science, I have to admit from the outset. Empirical analytical social science would collect populist examples. But what would it choose to begin with, right? Which ones would it pick? As I said, there are hundreds. And once it had picked 100 or so, what would it do? Well, it would look for what is common between them and what is different and develop its category that way. So I very much prefer Hegel and Marx in looking at the most advanced intellectual product. You notice I corrected that advanced intellectual product by bringing in popular sovereignty, by bringing in elections, by bringing in the constituent power. But I still stay with the frame. So that's sort of the Hegelian Marxist answer. I know that it's facetious because ultimately, why not pick somebody else? He's so much better than other people who have written on it. You know, it's anybody who studies the history of ideas notices that he's systematic and he knows the phenomenon and he's even politically committed. But someone else could be equally good whom I don't even know about. And that's your question. So comes then Husserl and pre-understanding. I am Hungarian and I'm American. And so I have been immersed in the phenomenon, I would say since 1989. If you look at the early things I've written, I've actually written on István Csurka. No one else knows his name except Barbara. I looked at István Csurka's challenge to the regime change. And so I've seen this phenomenon. And it could have been done in Poland too, by looking at how solidarity has developed. And in the United States, obviously, since the Tea Party and Trump, we have been immersed in this phenomenon. And being immersed in a life world, which is to an important extent structured by these, I look at theories. And, you know, there are lots of analyses pro and contra populism. But are they on the same level as this essay of Laclau? And I don't think they are. And the fact that he's a friend of populism, I don't know if you challenge that part, Adam. I prefer choosing a friend than an enemy. You know, I could have chosen one of the enemies, Müller, or who is equally convincing as an anti-populist. Well, the various people who are in Carlos de la Torre's anthologies. In the Hungarian case, obviously I could have picked Halmai on constitutionalism and populism. And I could have picked Federico too. I prefer picking a friend of populism. And Marx, I hate to say it because I don't want to put myself in his place, he chose those who were extremely positive about the capitalist economy, as Adam Smith and Ricardo Shurley were. They assumed to be the most fundamental step in human progress that has ever been taken in the economic realm. and that gives them confidence that what they describe can't be just a function of anger and of resentment and of value-free rejection. I know I'm not fully convincing myself, and so I don't believe that I could have fully convinced Adam asking this question, but I consider that this question to be a really cogent one. Now, it will be in our book as well. The way we do it in our book, I begin with this immanent criticism, and then I add Max Weber. In other words, immanent critique, you get to the first stage, and then you have to recognize that what you constructed through the immanent critique is only a frame of ideal types, only a framework of ideal types. And you cannot just use a set of ideal types dogmatically. So I ask, what are the things that this ideal typical construction gained through immanent critique leave out? And I did that today, except I didn't refer to Max Weber, who's my second lodestar. You know, everything that critical Marxism does, from Adorno, Horkheimer, from Marcuse on to Habermas, is always under the twin lodestars of Marx and Weber. And I should have mentioned Weber, but I was trying to rush toward the second part of the lecture. And from Max Weber, I get the idea that this is just an ideal set of ideal types that need to be corrected. And I correct Laclau's set through elections, the constituent power, and host ideologies. Those are not present in Laclau. So perhaps this step from Marx to Weber is going to convince you a little more than you were convinced before.
And no, I just wanted to perhaps, I don't know if further complicate or just provide, try to add to Udipta's question and what you address, what you were addressing, Andrew, that one of the ways that is perhaps interesting to, and that you're going to see through the course, to classify populisms is through a nativist exclusionary logic or an emancipatory logic. What seems like, what of course all of them have in common, both, and I'll try to more or less define what they are, but what all of populisms have in common, besides what Andrew already mentioned, is that they have a, I'm going to say allergy or reticence, but an allergy to certain types of liberal democratic ways, particularly freedom of the press and separation of powers. Especially, they crave to control the judiciary because of many reasons. But that's all of them. However, then you see historically that some of them have a different type, perhaps of enemy, like Laclau, or like Andrew is saying through Laclau, and a conception of the people. Trump, or let's be like Voldemort, the former president that shall not be named, Le Pen, Salvini in Italy, Modi in India, and others, they have a conception of the people in an exclusionary nativist way. This means that they think that certain others are not and will never perhaps be part of the people, and therefore perhaps they do not say like the fascists they should be, although some of them, maybe Udipta will correct me, and even in the US, like the fascists would say that we have to exterminate them or we have to kick them out. Well, populists do say that. They do want to exclude them, or they prefer to not have them around. They believe that they are the enemies, and they believe that they are the reasons why that silent majority is suffering, etc. But then you have the emancipatory ones. They're called emancipatory because, and this particular coming in Latin American countries, except Colombia, is that in that, and also the left-wing populism in Europe, like Podemos or yeah. And what they believe is that, in fact, they seem to have a more expansionary notion of the people, and perhaps the enemy is not a people defined an ethnic, racial, religious, nationalist way, but on classist or perhaps these are foreign organizations, foreign institutions. These are elites that are not defined, are just defined because they control they control the press or they control the judiciary, but it's not defined on ethnic or racial terms. I think it's an important distinction, and I tell you, particularly from a biographical point of view of mine, in Argentina, of course, Peronism, at least Kirchnerism, late current Peronism, is more emancipatory. So yes, there is I do have a problem with their way of controlling the judiciary. But once I'm here in the US, I find myself as a foreign Hispanic, and I am more fearful of the nativist exclusionary populism than the other one, because of course I become their target from a positionality point of view. I would just leave it there. I already talked too much. Thank you.
Yeah, Emma, of course, demonstrates to the class how fantastic my older students are. He's really a pro. He's been teaching a lot too. So it's not as if anyone could be surprised by what he says. I'm, of course, especially grateful because he, like Udipta, has completed my lecture. I had another category of distinction which I didn't get to. You know, I did populism in its different epochs. Then I did populism in its different organizational forms. And then I should do populism across different host ideologies. This is the left-right issue. It's a fundamental distinction. I mean, Chantal Mouffe knows why she wrote such a book, although I have problems with it, but still, let's first of all see the advantages, which are pretty much summed up by Emmanuel, namely the most fundamental distinction of left and right populisms is, I would first say, choice of host ideology, and then secondly, as following from that, the point he has stressed, the choice of who the people are. That's really how it works. Clearly, when someone calls their populism a socialism of the 21st century, not too surprising that it's the host ideology of socialism that is being chosen. And in the case of Syriza, Podemos, it is radical social democracy that is the host ideology, because they are not Leninist parties. They look back to the past of social democracy in Europe when it was more reformist, more radical, and more interventionist than the current more oligarchic version tends to be. And of course, the other choice is the nation. And we know that with the nation, there are several choices right away. Is it the ethnic or the civic nation? Is it the religio-ethnic or the civic? And yeah, I mean, there's no question Nehru was a nationalist, but he's civic. And I think there is a possibility, at least, that the choice in India now that is being made by populists is the ethno-religious. And of course, you refer to Le Pen, its ethnic choice. They want the welfare state, but only for French people. And the element I already mentioned in the case of Trump is the white nationalist component, which is interestingly enough also religious, except for the fact that it has become somewhat ecumenical. I don't know how well it will stand up to having a Catholic president, which happened today, because most of the militants have not been Catholic. The violent ones have not been Catholic. They come from really, from much more Protestant milieus, although I'm not sure if this is entirely correct. That would have to be explored. So the choice of a host ideology and the choice of the people, who the people are. Now, the first question, does it make a difference? You know, Emmanuel demonstrated it through his own travels. It was fine in Argentina, where he was part of the people, though he's an Italian guy, but still, it was not exclusionary with respect to immigrants. It's an immigrant nation anyway, Argentina. And for better or for worse, it does not have a very large uh, 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 well, it has almost zero indigenous population, but its uh, uh, mestizo population is relatively small, although I'm not sure there are any real numbers for that. Anyhow, they were not excluded. Argentine imperialism never made a distinction, as far as I know, between white and mestizo. And so in that sense, he was included, and there was no problem. Now, whether some of his relatives who might have been fairly high in the social hierarchy were equally included, I don't know. But certainly the exclusion occurs on class lines. And of course, class is something that we can change. I mean, after all, Engels was an industrialist, right? And nevertheless, he could become a major theorist for the proletariat. So the class base of exclusion is not as harsh. So in this sense, left populism is less exclusionary. And I think given that in the problem in democracy is always the problem of inclusion, in this sense, left populism is less hostile to democracy. But it has problems. You mentioned them. You were fair enough to mention them. And and I will remember what you said. Liberal rights and separation of powers are no friends to populism. So some of the institutions of democracy are a problem. And in that sense, you made your case that at least inclusion is in a much better shape, but democracy could have some problems even under left populism, as you yourself has said, and as we have, of course, experienced in lots of settings. That's a bigger problem, however, than even you admitted, but Ernesto Laclau has this within his theory. It means the possibility of floating. Floating. In other words, if you reject separation of powers. I found this on the web for what it means, the possibility. I don't know, my phone begins to talk. That is really crazy. Probably you guys are sending messages through the, and my phone registers it. It's really insane, this environment. I have 4 machines in the house, and I'm using this one because it works the best for this purpose. Anyway, so because it's anti-liberal, an anti-pluralist, one might add, this means the possibility of actually trying to make appeals once classes no longer give sufficient foundation to other groups, which means also that you try to unify their discourse within your chain of equivalences. And this could mean that you actually go to some extent to the right. This has happened for the French Communist Party. And it happens in some cases that anti-immigrant rhetoric is picked up by left-wing parties. I think it's going to be an interesting question for Five Star, which is the Italian version of a more leftist populism, because Salvini has demonstrated that there's a lot of the electorate is on the right. So how much floating is going to happen? So that's problem one. And then problem two is, of course, the embodiment model. You reject separation of powers. That means, of course, that only one branch speaks for the people. And even if the people are everybody, it only should have one voice. And that has been present in even progressive forms of populism. So yes, I think one can make a value difference, a value distinction between, if you want, Syriza and Golden Dawn, between Five Star and the Northern League, or the League, perhaps even examples of this exist in Latin America. But still, we should be worried about left populism too, and should criticize it. But there is an argument to be made, like you just made, that from a normative point of view, of course, this has to do with the host ideologies. And the host ideology that I would prefer is radical social democracy to any version of nationalism. And so it's natural that from my point of view, I will, in some sense, be more accepting of left populism, but I would nevertheless continue to argue about its dangers too.